Hello everyone, this video accompanies the learning module on Renaissance. And the idea here is for me to give you some background of the larger social, historical context of the time. Provides a backdrop for a lot of what we read this week. Meaning of the Renaissance. It represented more than just a revival of learning. It was also a revival of the arts, an emphasis on the arts, changes in social, political life. In many ways, it can be described as a whole creative period where artistic standards were used to judge almost every aspect of life. Furniture, clothing, war, politics were judged by artistic standards. Values stressed in the Renaissance were aesthetic, but they were also ethical and political. This is a beginning time in Western tradition where scholars really began to understand they could learn from studying the past. And they were particularly interested in the Greeks and Romans. They favored Roman literature, however, because it was the work of their own ancestors. But they also understood that the Romans were influenced by the Greeks, and that Roman literature and history could be best understood by understanding the Greeks as well. In terms of language, Latin was still very much a living language at this time. It was in constant use by the church, professions, schools. It had changed, however. Because of use, the church had added new words, expressions, so it wasn't the same Latin that existed 400 or 500 years before. And it was also beginning to fall out of favor at this time, particularly with the growth of modern languages, as people began to identify with their own nations and their own languages. They began to emphasize the use of modern languages: French, Italian, German, English. And much of what they spoke, even in the vernacular languages, very different from what we'd understand today. It was really the beginning of a sense of national identity. So Latin would continue to be used for a long time. It was still very much the language of the church, and would be for several hundred years more the language of instruction in higher education. Important to understand that Renaissance was not a revolution. It was not a sudden upheaval. It was a gradual process. Italy was the focal point of the revolution, and this is largely because of its geographic nature. Italy was a bridge between the East and Western worlds over which trade took place. Keep in mind, when we trade products, money, etc., we also trade culture and ideas. Also, because of its location, Italy had been the seat of the Roman Empire, and Roman laws and traditions continued to exist long after Rome had collapsed. Some of the changes in education during this time, one of the most noted was an expansion of the curriculum. It began to include an understanding of literature and understanding life through literature. Also began to expand offerings in terms of the study of philosophy, as well as professions such as law and medicine. Some aspects of education were revived. During the Roman era, there was a decline in oratory toward the end of the Roman Empire. Oratory began to take a place in the curriculum again. Others remained unchanged. History, for a large part, did not exist in the way we understand it. They studied history through literature, so history was secondary compared to the literature itself. But one thing that did continue to be the same, and would remain the same for a long time, is that education was largely directed to the privileged and males. New areas of study began to emerge, such as commerce, banking, business, but there was really no effort at addressing education for the poor. And education for women made up only a very small part of the upper classes. Some improvements in education. Books became more widely available with the invention of the printing press. Books could be produced for lower cost, which allowed more uniformity of texts, and it made class discussions easier. This also facilitated instruction in language and grammar as more reading materials became available. At the same time, schools began to obtain some freedom from the church, and next week when we look at the Reformation, we will see that especially begin to happen as not just educational institutions, but the nations themselves begin to assert their national identity and reject much of the control of the church. So that's some background for this week. As usual, I'll be around. You know where to find me. If you have any questions, please reach out to me right away. Have a good week, everyone.